Chapter 21 of The Great White North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by AndrewWade. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 21. Journeys of Dr. A. Bunge and Baron E. von Toll. Exploration in Spitzbergen. Sir Martin Conway, Dr. A. G. Nathorst, Professor J. H. Gore, Andre's balloon expedition to the North Pole. Search for Andre by Theodore Lerner. J. Stradling, Dr. A. G. Nathorst. Captain Bade. Walter Wellman's plan to reach the pole from Spitzbergen. Italian expedition under Duke of Abruzzi. The loss of Stellar Polar. Captain Umberto Cagni's journey. Breaks the record. Retreat. Home. Baldwin Ziegler expedition of 1900. Complete equipment. Return of expedition in autumn. Ziegler expedition under Anthony Fiala. The America reaches high northing. Winters in Triplets Bay. Is destroyed. Failure of sledge journeys. Relief ship does not come. Second winter. Return of party by Terra Nova in 1903. The voyage of Jeannette, among other valuable scientific results, had proven Wrangel Land to be an island of moderate size. The drift of the Fram had demonstrated the theory of a polar ocean of vast dimensions and great depth. The interest, therefore, in Arctic exploration for the next few years was centered in numerous scientific parties, which thoroughly examined, surveyed, and explored the unknown sections of lands bordering on the polar basin. As early as 1885, an expedition was fitted out under the auspices of the Imperial Russian Geographical Society and placed in charge of Dr. A. Bunge and Baron E. von Toll for scientific and geographical work in the Siberian island. Toll visited Nova Sibir and traversed the entire coast of Illinois. In the meantime, Dr. Bunge explored Great Lykhof, where he secured a valuable collection of fossils. Toll returned again to the Arctic in 1893, visiting the northeast of Jana for the purpose of securing a well-preserved mammoth. Afterward, in company with Lieutenant Shaliko, he visited the New Siberian island with dog sledges, traveled on the west coast of Illinois as far as 75 degrees 37 minutes north latitude, establishing 2 depots of provisions for Nansen's possible use. Among other important results of this expedition was the discovery of evidence that in the mammoth periods trees grew no less than 3 degrees north of their present limit. Toll returned to the mainland and followed the Lena, reporting impassable tundras from Sviatoy, Knowles to Jddykst, and reached Yeniseisk the 4th of December. Later geographical researches were made on the Great Lykhof Island. Baron Toll determined upon another voyage to the Arctic for the purpose of supplementing the geographical knowledge of Bennett and other islands, and to complete a journey of exploration to Sanikoff Land, first seen by him in 1886. The Saria was fitted out for this expedition, and the winter of 1900 to 1901 passed in 76 degrees 8 minutes north latitude and 95 degrees east longitude. On April 18, 1901, writes von Toll, immediately after the Feast of Easter, Lieutenant Kolomizov and the zoologist A. Borelja set out with 2 sleighs, each with a team of 8 dogs, the object of the first being to reach the Yenisei and establish coaling stations, while the second was directed to accompany it as far as Cape Sterlegoff, some 200 wersts distant. 2 days later began my excursion with Lieutenant Koltschak to the Chelyuskin Peninsula, accompanied by a sleigh with a team of 12 dogs and laden as lightly as possible. On May 1st, we reached that point on the bay where we had established a depot the previous year, 1900. The provisions and fish here buried were to complete our supplies, which barely sufficed just 1 month, but we were unable to dig out the deposit from the deep snow. On May 7th, we started from this place in an east-northern easterly direction, with the intention of pushing it on to St. Thaddeus Bay on the east coast of the Chelyuskin Peninsula, and returning thence along the coast. After traversing the tundra for 40 wersts in this direction, we again came unexpectedly on an inlet, which grew narrower towards the west-southwest, where it assumed the form of a narrow sound or river mouth. The position was determined by Lieutenant Koltschak. Off the side of the bay was 76 degrees 17 minutes north and 90 degrees 29 degrees east. On May 12th, the tired dogs were given a day's rest. Then Toll made a day's march half a degree eastward on Canadian snowshoes. There were no prospects for adding to their limited food supply by hunting, so it became necessary to retrace their steps. Hitherto, writes Toll, we had contended with almost constant difficulties caused by fog and deep snow, already softened by the sun. But henceforth we had to struggle with the contrary snowstorms, which lasted almost without break for 14 days. The consequence was the loss of 5 dogs, which broke down one after another through exhaustion. On May 30th, we reached the Saria, the excursion having lasted 41 days. Of these, we had to pass 9 in sleeping sack during the fiercest snowstorms. 4 were uselessly wasted at the depot, and during the remaining 28 days, we covered 500 worths. Other excursions were made by members of the party with more gratifying results. The release of the Saria was confidently hoped for early in August, but in the interim, writes Baron Toll, there was still to be solved a geographical question, namely to discover the mouth of the Tamir River. According to the maps hitherto published, the Tamir was supposed to discharge in the first or second of the larger bights lying to the east of the Tamir Sound. Both of these were twice explored by Lieutenant Kolsmioff, and in the first was in fact found the mouth of a considerable stream. But its configuration was not all in accordance with the contour lines given by the topographer Wagenoff on Middendorf's chart. In the second, no indication could be detected of any river mouth. As these researches had been undertaken in winter amid fogs and snowdrifts, there still remained a doubt, which could only be removed by fresh investigations carried out in the clear summer weather. Should these also lead to negative results, the only remaining assumption should be that the Tamar discharged into that bight which, during the journey to the interior of the Chelyuskin Peninsula, Lieutenant Kolchak and I had crossed, since no considerable stream assuredly entered the other inlet where the depot lay. The survey of the first 2 bays was undertaken by Borelja and Dr. Walter, their excursion lasting from July 20 to August 15, 1901. Respecting the question of the Tamir, the 2 savants came to negative results. Still, they confirmed Kolsmioff's discovery of large estuary in the first of the 2 bays. On the 25th of August, the fissures in the ice had expanded. The whole of the ice pack round the Saharia set in motion, and she drifted in the direction of the cliffs of Station Island. Slowly she was carried through the Fram Strait to the open sea. Withdrawing behind a cape at Nansen Island, the Saharia waited the drifting away of the ice pack. On August 30, the waterway was free, and she began her voyage to Kolt Etnoy Island. Doubling Cape Chelyuskin on September 1, she sighted 3 days later the east coast of Tamir Peninsula without meeting any ice. As we draw near, writes Toll, to the New Siberian Archipelago, in favorable weather till September 7th, a strong southeaster began to blow in our teeth, and against this we made very slow headway. I therefore changed the course to the northeast. On September 9th, we reached the edge of the ice pack in 79 degrees 9 minutes north and 14 degrees east. Here we encountered a southern gale, which, acting in concert with the marine current, drove the Saharia 30 miles to the northwest. The storm veered around the west-southwest, and I thought it better again to make the most of the wind and now direct our course southeastwards for Bennet Island, instead of trying, under these circumstances, to penetrate into the ice in search of land. On September 11th, the imposing headland of Cape Emma at Bennet Island suddenly loomed up before us out of the fog, and presently again wrapped in fog. We had approached to within 12 knots of the island, when our further advance towards it was barred by a belt of 14 feet thick of impenetrable ice. Here we remained 2 days in hope that the ice might shift, but in vain. Disappointed in his hopes for reaching Sanikoff Island in 1902, Baron Toll succeeded in sheltering the Saharia for a second winter at Nerpichi Bay, Kot Elnoy Island, 75 degrees, 22 minutes north, 137 degrees, 16 minutes east. The sad disaster which overtook the brave scientist ends a chapter valuable to Arctic achievement. On June 7, 1902, Baron Toll, accompanied by Seeberg the astronomer and 2 hunters, left for a geological excursion, and after arduous efforts landed on Bennet Island August 3rd, which was found to be a plateau some 1,500 feet in height. Their researches disclosed Cambrian deposits. They left the island to return to the ship on November 8, 1902, and were never seen again. Brunsniff and Koltzak, in relief expedition in 1904, discovered a record containing the information just stated, but no other traces were found of these courageous men who sacrificed their lives in the cause of science. Another scene of activity was centered in Spitzbergen, for crossing which in 1896 Sir Martin Conway and party received the applause of the world. The following year he again returned to continue his explorations. Dr. A.G. Nahorst circumnavigated Spitzbergen in 1898, surveying and mapping the irregular coastline with admirable precision. The same year, Professor J.H. Gore of the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey made pendulum observations in Spitzbergen for the determination of the force of gravity in that latitude. Prince Albert of Monaco and the party cruised along the coast for the purpose of making scientific observations. So active had been in the interest in this hitherto unclaimed archipelago that Russia began to assert her rights to ownership. The most unique venture for the polar honors was undertaken in 1897 by Solomon August André, a Swede whose two companions, Mr. Steinberg and Mr. Trenkel, from Dane Island, north of Spitzbergen. André was an ardent apostle of aerial conquest of the North Pole. His balloon, the Ornan, had a cubical contents of 4,500 meters, and the shape of a spear terminating in a slightly conical appendage. The envelope was made of 600 pieces of Bunge silk, each being from 17 to 18 meters long, about 48 centimeters wide. These were sewn together by machines, then subjugated to a process of cementing with a special varnish. A carefully made net composed of hemp cords encompassed the envelope. Special valves were devised by André. The car was of a cane basket work, mounted on a frame of chestnut wood, the bottom being strengthened by wood cross beams, the whole covered with tarpaulin with necessary openings, provisioned with tins of preserved food, chocolate, compressed bread, condensed milk, champagne, claret, butter, fresh water, and alcohol, besides a cooking apparatus and other necessary equipment. This frail craft made its ascension with its human freight July 11, 1897. The last farewells were brief and touching, writes Alexis Macaron. Few words are exchanged, but hearty handclasps between those whose hearts are in sympathy say more than words. Suddenly, André snatches himself away from the embraces of his friends and takes his place on the wicker bridge of the car, from whence he calls in a firm voice, "Steinberg, Freinunkel, let's go!" His two companions at once take their places beside him. Each is armed with a knife for cutting ropes supporting the groups of the ballast bags. André is always calm, cold, and impassible. Not a trace of emotion is visible, nothing but expression of firm resolution and indomitable will. He is just the man for such an enterprise, and he is well seconded by his two companions. At length the decisive moment arrives. 1, 2, cut, cries André in Swedish. The three sailors obey the orders simultaneously, and in 1 second the aerial ship, free and unfettered, rises majestically into space, saluted by our heartiest cheers. Scattered along the shore we stand motionless, with full hearts and anxious eyes, gazing at the silent horizon. For some moments then, between two hills, we perceive a gray speck over the sea, very, very far away, and then it finally disappears. The way to the pole is clear. No more obstacles to encounter: the sea, the ice fields, and the unknown. André. Out of the great white north came a lone survivor, a carrier pigeon, bringing the tidings written July 13th, 12:30 p.m., 82 degrees, 2 minutes north latitude, 15 degrees, 5 minutes east longitude. Good journey eastward, 10 degrees south. All goes well on board. This is the fourth message sent by pigeon. But all did not go well. In June 1899, a buoy containing a note from André was found in Norway. It had been thrown out 8 hours after departure. The North Pole buoy, to be dropped when the pole was passed, was found empty in September 1899, on the north side of King Charles Island. A third buoy, almost empty, was picked up on the west coast of Iceland, July 17, 1900, and another reported from Norway, August 31, 1900. Contained a note stating that the buoy was thrown out at 10 p.m., July 11, 1897, at an altitude of 823 feet, moving north 45 east. Thus the carrier pigeon was the last messenger, the harbinger of André's last word to friends on earth. The fate of the three brave spirits lies buried in the Arctic silence. Theodore Lerner was one of the first to hurry to Spitzbergen in 1898, leading the German scientific expedition to obtain news from André if possible, and the same year the Swedish Anthropological and Geographical Society sent J. Stradling with companions to the Lena Delta, the mouth of the Yenisei, and the islands of New Siberia, where they searched in vain for traces of their missing compatriots. Again in 1899, Dr. A. G. Nathorst returned his attention to eastern Greenland in an unsuccessful search for tidings of Andre, making valuable maps and observations of the fjord system of King Oscar Fjord. Nor did Captain Bade in his explorations in East Spitzbergen, King Charles Land, and Franz Josef Land in 1900 find any traces of the missing aeronaut. In the year 1894, Walter Wellman, an American, made Spitzbergen the base of his activities in an attempt to penetrate the polar pack and reach the North Pole. Sailing in the Ragnvald Jarl, he had the misfortune to lose his ship off of Walden Island. Undaunted by his grave disaster, he pushed north with sledges as far as 81 degrees, but had to retrace his steps owing to the impenetrable condition of the ice. He had, however, reached the north point of Platten Island. Wellman again endeavored to conquer the ice in 1898, this time choosing for his base Franz Josef Land. He was liberally fitted out and accompanied, among others, by Evelyn B. Baldwin of the United States Weather Bureau. Mr. Wellman made his headquarters at Harmsworth House at Cape Tegethoff for 3 years, the Arctic home of Frederick A. Jackson and his companions. In February 1899, Mr. Wellman and the 3 companions started for the pole with every promise of success. An unforeseen accident to Mr. Wellman and an upheaval in the ice, which destroyed many dogs and much of their equipment, necessitated a hurried return to headquarters. Disappointed but not discouraged, Wellman organized a series of important scientific observations and explorations, during which Evelyn Baldwin, in a long sledge journey to Wilczek Land, determined its eastern boundary and discovered, among other islands to the northeast, Graham Bell Island. To that daring and adventurous prince, H.R.H. Luigi Amadeo of Savoy, the Duke of Abruzzi, is one of the most interesting chapters in Arctic history. There is a charm in the graceful dedication of his book, To Her Majesty the Queen Mother, as well as his gallant tribute to his brave companions who won laurels under his direction and fought gallantly in the dangers of the Arctic under his banner. Italians and Norwegians behaved throughout this voyage as though they were a crew composed of one nationality, he says. I had the comrades with me rather than the subordinates. I express therefore my gratitude towards all, since to their harmonious cooperation is due the success of my expedition, and I express the same gratitude to the memory of the 3 brave men who perished whilst on the sledge expedition. The Jason, having carrying a capacity of 570 tons cargo, was purchased by the Duke, renamed the Stella Polar, refitted, equipped, provisioned, and manned for 4 years, at the total cost of £38,413 sterling. The second in command to the Duke of Abruzzi, who, by the way, was but 26 years old at the time of his adventure, was Captain Umberto Cagni of the Italian Navy, in charge of the scientific operations. The other officers of the Navy were Lieutenant Francisco Cruini, in charge of the mineralogical collections, and Dr. Achille C. Molinelli, medical officer, also in charge of the zoological and botanical collections. 4 other officers, a crew of 12, and 4 especially experienced guides completed the personnel of the expedition. Under the personal advice and superintendence of Dr. Nansen, who aided in every possible way the success of the expedition, a carefully thought-out plan was made by which the Stella Polar was to leave Archangel early in July, make for Cape Flora in the Northbrook Island, establish a depot provisioned for 8 months, then proceed to take up winter quarters as far north as possible. Close to the lands lying west of Franz Josef Land, sledge journeys in the autumn would establish a chain of provision caches on the lands to the north, and in the spring of a sledge journey to the north for a world record would be undertaken. A retreat to the depot at Cape Flora, with or without the ship, would ensure subsistence until the arrival of a relief ship could be sent in 2 years. Or, if the relief ship failed, a retreat to Nova Zembla or Spitzbergen would be undertaken by boats. On June 30th, 1899, the Stella Polar reached Archangel, where 121 dogs were taken aboard to be used in the sledge journeys. On 12th of July, she weighed anchor and proceeded on her voyage. Ice was encountered. July 17th, and 3 days later, Northbrook Island was sighted, and a visit was made to Jackson's huts and Lee Smith's winter quarters. The Stella Polar bravely fought her way through unfavorable ice conditions and succeeded in reaching 82 degrees 4 minutes north, 59 degrees east by the British Channel, securing an anchorage in Teplitz Bay, Prince Rudolf Land. She received a disastrous nip September 7th when she sprang a leak, and it became necessary to disembark her provisions and establish winter quarters on Rudolf Land. As our ship, which we had abandoned after it had been seized by the ice, writes the Duke of Abruzzi, was the only means of our returning home in the following year, we had to consider how to save her. Part of the engines, the condenser, and the furnaces were under water, which had frozen to a thickness of about 19 inches. The ship had not changed her position, but had heeled over some still more, as the ice which supported her had given way. The water had first to be pumped out of the ship to enable us to find the leak on the left side, and this had to be mended as well, that which was visible on the right side. We had then to see if it would be possible to keep the ship dry, and if not, to protect the engine so that we might remain under water during the winter without being injured. Such was the work before us. At that time I did not believe it possible, but Captain Cagney never despaired for a moment of being able to carry it out, and if it was accomplished, it was owing to his strong will and to his perseverance, which was never discouraged by any difficulties. Early in the winter, the Duke of Abruzzi, in which one of his sled excursions, had the misfortune to freeze part of his left hand, which resulted in the loss of the joints of 2 of his fingers. This unfortunate accident prevented his accompanying the spring sledge journey to the north, for which active preparations were already in progress. The sledges and kayaks were patterned after those used by Dr. Nansen. The former 11 feet 5 inches long, 6 inches wide, and 6 1/2 inches high, was the convex runner shod with plates of white metal, and were saturated with a mixture of pitch, stearine, and tallow, to render them more slippery and durable. After careful calculations by Dr. Molinelli, the rations to be carried were estimated at 2 pounds 12 ounces, 9 drams per day for each man, consisting of biscuit, tinned meat, pemmican, butter, milk, Liebig's extract, desiccated vegetables, Italian paste, sugar, coffee, tea, chocolate, etc. The first start was made in February, but after traveling in the extreme cold for several days, the party returned and made a fresh start March 11th. The expedition was composed of 10 men and 13 sledges, which with their loads weighed 551 pounds each and was drawn by 102 dogs. It had been previously settled to send back detachments after 12, 24, and 36 days. The last detachment remained in the field 72 days. Cagney, however, modified these plans, and in the meantime the Duke of Abruzzi anxiously waited the return of the first detachment. On April 18th, the second detachment returned to camp. They had left Commander Cagney March 31st. The first detachment, consisting of Lieutenant Carini, Stolkin, and Ollier, had started to return March 23rd. An immediate search was instituted for the missing men, but without results. After every effort had been expended, the 3 men were given up for lost. Meantime, the other supporting parties having returned, anxiety was beginning to manifest itself for Cagney. The day set for his return had come and gone. On May 19th, Dr. Molini and 2 companions had set out for Cape Fliggy with provisions for 10 days to look for him. The Duke of Abruzzi anxiously scanned the horizon with his telescope for signs of missing companions. After an absence of 104 days, Captain Cagney, with 3 companions, having made a world record and reached 86 degrees 34 minutes, was sighted in the distance and welcomed home by his impatient and enthusiastic companions. Although their strength had been much reduced, writes Abruzzi, by want of sufficient food, they were not exhausted. The 7 dogs which survived seemed much worse. Some of them were merely skin and bone. The only part of their outfit had brought back was still capable of being of any use, was their tent, and this had been mended. The framework of all the kayaks had been broken, and their canvas torn, so they could not be used unless a week was spent mending them. The sledges which remained had been mended with pieces of other sledges. All of that was left of their cooking utensils was the outer covering of the stove, a saucepan which had been mended, and the plates. The Primus lamp had been replaced by a pot, in which dog's grease had been burned for the last few weeks. The sleeping bag had been thrown away, and only the thick canvas lining kept. Their clothes were in rags. Cagney had advanced under the same trying conditions of hummocky ice, slush, and deep snow, which had been encountered by Nansen. He had the misfortune to freeze one of his fingers and suffered excruciating pain, necessitating his operating with his own hand and removing the dead mass with a pair of scissors. He had steadily advanced until April 25, 1900. His return journey covered 60 days under the most alarming conditions, for on May 18th he writes, "I feel more and more every day a terrible anxiety with regard to our fate. After marching 9 days toward the southeast, we are nearly on the same meridian, owing to the southwest drift of the ice pack. 4 weeks more of almost superhuman effort brought them to Harley Island, from which point they made their way to Rudolph Island. With the achievement of this brilliant record, it now remained but to free the Stella Polar by blasting and cutting channels about her snug quarters. The brief Arctic summer having set in, her deliverance was last secured. At 1:30 in the morning of August 16, everything was ready, and we steamed slowly away from the shore, giving 3 cheers as we turned round the ice of the bay which had held us so long imprisoned. In contrast to the Italian expedition, the Baldwin-Ziegler Polar Expedition, to which sailed from Tromsø, Norway, July 17, 1900, stands out conspicuously. Mr. Baldwin was born in Springfield, Missouri in 1862, and he had seen Arctic service with the Peary expedition of 1893 through 1894, and had come near being one of the ill-fated André balloon party. He had done good service with Wellman in Franz Josef Land, and now, with the unlimited means put at his disposal by the munificence of Mr. Wilman Ziegler of New York, he proposed to conquer the pole. "Our fleet," wrote Mr. Baldwin in McClure's Magazine, September 1901, "comprises 3 vessels. The America, our flagship, as some one expressed it, is a 3-masted ship-rigged steamer of 466 tons net burden, driving a single screw. Her length overall was 157 feet, beam 27 feet, depth 19 feet. The Frithjof is a Norwegian sailing vessel. The 3rd vessel is the Belgia, which carried the Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 through 1899 under Captain Gerlache. Never before in the history of polar expeditions was food and equipment carried in such luxurious profusion. The 3 vessels were as many floating hotels with larders lacking nothing but foresight, experience, and the generosity of Mr. Ziegler could suggest or procure. The scientific equipment was also complete, including small balloons with releasing devices for depositing records when the ground was reached, buoys with records to be sent floating back to civilization by currents, searchlights, and wireless telegraph. Beside the standard scientific instruments for meteorological, astronomical, and geodetic work, there were 320 dogs and 15 ponies in charge of 6 expert Russian drivers. The present expedition, wrote Mr. Baldwin, typifies the spirit of the 20th century. And he adds, no previous expedition to the north has ever made such complete arrangements for the transmission of news back to civilization as that which I have the honor to command. The America and Frithjof left Tromsø, Norway, in July of 1901 for Franz Josef Land, which Baldwin regarded as the best starting point for a polar adventure, writes Mr. P. F. McGrath in the Review of Reviews, July 1905. Proceeding to Alger Island in a latitude of 80 degrees 24 minutes north, longitude 55 degrees 52 minutes east, where he established his winter quarters. The Frithjof unloaded her stores and proceeded south, leaving the America harbored with the dogs and equipment ashore, portable houses erected, and a detail of duties being carried out. The personnel comprised of 42 souls, 17 Americans, 6 Russians, and 19 shipmen, mostly Norwegians. Game was plentiful, and several tons of bear and walrus meat were accumulated, the former for the men and the latter for the dogs. With this base beyond the 18th parallel, Baldwin intended to push forward with his ship over the ice, exploring the adjacent region for uncharted land masses, which would supply stationary points, ensuring him against the disadvantages of an advance across the shifting ice. And the furthest north of these he would, next spring, make his dash across the crystal fields for the pole. In this he would employ about 25 men as vanguard and reserve, the flying column pushing rapidly ahead, and the transport train following with the heavier supplies. Numerically, the party would be strong enough to overcome otherwise serious obstacles, while the quantity of supplies to be carried by 320 dogs and 15 ponies would put the possibility of disaster almost out of question. With this elaborate program, and the knowledge that the Duke of Abruzzi, with much smaller party, obtained a northing of 86 degrees 33 minutes, Baldwin confidently anticipated making the pole, and as in this segment of the Arctic Circle he might find himself, in returning, obliged by ice and currents to head for the Greenland coast, which reaches 83 degrees 27 minutes, or 180 miles nearer the pole than his base. He planned that if he should be swerved westward by the tides, it would be easier to reach that shore, and he would find musk oxen to eke out his supplies, and the journey down the east coast, where the depot was made by the Belgica, for him. But often happens in polar work, Baldwin's hopes were blasted. Dissensions rent his party asunder. His dogs perished by the score, and after a futile attempt to get north, he and his whole party returned to Tromoso in August 1902, while the Frithiof, which had sailed for Alger Island a month previous with additional outfits and news for him, had to retreat, owing to the unbroken ice pack. The return of the Baldwin-Ziegler expedition in the autumn of 1902 was followed by that reorganized by Mr. Ziegler and given to the leadership of Mr. Anthony Fiala of Brooklyn, New York, to be carried out on practically the same lines laid out by Mr. Baldwin. Captain Edward Coffin of Edgartown, Massachusetts, was chosen as the navigating officer, and he assembled an American crew, most of them experienced whalers. Of the field staff, Mr. William J. Peters of the Geological Survey, and representing the National Geographic Society, was chosen as chief scientist and second in command of the expedition. The results of his systematic records and magnetical observations when in the north were of the highest value, and he rendered the most efficient service. After collecting stores and equipment, the America sailed from Trondheim, Norway, June 23, 1903. Brief stops were made at the island of Tromo and Archangel, where dogs, ponies, and additional stores were taken aboard. The ice was first met July 13th in 74 degrees 51 minutes north latitude, 38 degrees 37 minutes east longitude, through which the America steamed and blasted her way to Cape Flora, which was reached August 12th. A few days later, Triplets Bay was passed, with the skeleton-like remains of the framework of the tent where lived the brave Abruzzi and his companions standing out in plain view. The America made the highest northing of a ship under steam in the western hemisphere, and reached a point of 82 degrees north latitude. She then returned to Triplets Bay. Upon landing, Fiala found the Abruzzi cache in excellent condition. Camp Abruzzi was established, and scientific work at once begun, and preparations commenced for the spring sledge journey to the north. Several gales struck in early October, and continued almost unremittingly until the last of the month, when they raged with such fury as to threaten the safety of the ship, and she bravely withstood the terrible ice pressures to which she was subjected to until January 23, when during a frightful hurricane she disappeared from view. The first week in March, a sledging journey was undertaken, comprising 26 men, 16 pony sledges, and 13 dog sledges. But the severity of storms, and the suffering and hardships enduring from cold, decided the party to return, and camp was reached on March 11. Other journeys of short duration were undertaken with similar success. Leaving part of the company at Camp Abruzzi, Fiala made a retreat to Cape Flora, there to await the promised ship relief, which was expected early August. His idea was to renew his North Pole dash the following season. The expected ship was eagerly watched for, but as the months sped by one, the ship did not come, and preparations were made for wintering. And in the liberal depots of the supplies left by Jackson, Abruzzi, and Andre were examined and found in excellent condition. Elmwood, Jackson's little house, was dug out and made habitable. Communication was frequent between Camp Abruzzi and Elmwood. Fiala, in a cold, dangerous journey, returned to Camp Abruzzi, where he made preparations for another spring journey toward the pole, to be undertaken with one companion, 3 dog teams, and a supporting column of 3 small detachments. Seaman Duffy, who had accompanied Fiala to Cape Barents in August 1904 and Camp Flora in June of the same year, was chosen as his companion. The start was made in March, but very slow progress was made. After days of disheartening travel, covering but few miles a day, the conditions grew worse instead of better. Our trail was from ice cake to ice cake, writes Fiala, while we crossed the separating water by means of ice bridges, laboriously constructed at the narrowest points with our ice picks. In other places we traversed monster pressure ridges that splintered and thundered under our feet, scaring the dogs until they whined and whimpered in their terror. It was difficult to find a cake of ice large enough for our small party to camp on. Deep snow and numerous water lanes, with a high temperature and attendant fog, also impeded our advance. On March 22nd, the advance was abandoned, and 10 days were occupied in the retreat. Camp Abruzzi was reached April 1st. The relief ship Terra Nova reached Cape Flora at the end of July, picked up the party and camped there, and touching at Cape Dillon, took aboard the remainder. It was then learned that in 1904 the Frithiof had made 2 bold attempts to reach Cape Flora, but had been unsuccessful. End of Chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of The Great White North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jddykst, Farragut, Iowa. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 22. Otto Sverdrup. 4 years' voyage of the Fram. Journeys in Ellesmere Land. Important exploration of Jones Sound. Discovery of new lands. Release of the Fram. Captain Roald Amundsen. The voyage of the Joa. Reaches head of Peterson Bay, King William Land. 2-year stay. Valuable scientific observations. Visits from Eskimos. Sledge journeys. Release from the ice. August 14, 1906. Completion of the Northwest Passage. Another Arctic winter. Sledge journey of Amundsen to Eagle City. Release of the Joa. Reaches San Francisco, 1907. In the Geographical Journal of November 1902, Sir Clements R. Markham, President of the Royal Geographical Society of London, commenting on the remarkable achievement of Otto Sverdrup and his gallant companions during 4 traveling seasons entailing 4 Arctic winters, expresses himself as follows. They have discovered the western side of Ellesmere Island and the intricate system of fjords, as well as 3 large islands west of Ellesmere Island. They have explored the northern coast of North Devon. They have connected Belcher's work with the coasts of Jones Sound. They have reached a point within 60 miles of Aldrich's farthest, and they have discovered that land north of the Peary Islands, the existence of which was conjectured as far west as the longitude of the eastern coast of Melville Island. This includes the discovery of the northern sides of North Cornwall and Findlay Islands. In addition to the main Arctic problem which is thus solved, it is likely that the regions discovered will be of exceptional interest, from the winds and currents, the varying character of the ice, the existence of coal beds, and the abundance of animal life. A systematic survey has been made of these important discoveries, checked by astronomical observations. We must look forward, concludes Markham, to an account of these things, and to the details of the expedition, with the deepest interest, and meanwhile we may well express admiration for the way in which the work was conceived and executed, and at the perfect harmony with which all loyally worked under their chief. Without such harmonious work, success was not possible. The Norwegian Otto Neumann Sverdrup was born in Bindalen in Helgeland in 1855. At 17 years of age he went to sea, passed his mate's examination in 1878, and for some years was captain of a ship. He accompanied Nansen on the Greenland expedition in 1888 to 1889, and was captain of the Fram on Nansen's famous polar voyage. A few days after the return of this expedition, in September 1896, while the Fram was lying in Lysaker Bay, Dr. Nansen came aboard one morning. "Do you still wish to go on another expedition to the north?" he asked Sverdrup. "Yes, certainly, if only I had the chance," came the prompt reply. Then Nansen told him that Consul Axel Heiberg and the firm of brewers, Messrs. Ringnes Brothers, were willing to finance and equip another scientific polar expedition, with Captain Sverdrup as leader. The Fram was loaned by the Norwegian government, and about 1,100 pounds was granted by the Storthing for necessary alterations and repairs. The personnel of the expedition was most carefully selected, including Lieutenant Victor Bandman of the Norwegian Navy, Lieutenant Ingvald Isaacson of the Army, the botanist Herman George Simmons, a graduate of the University of Lund, and Edvard Bay, zoologist, a graduate of the University of Copenhagen, the latter a member of Lieutenant Ryder's expedition to the east coast of Greenland in 1891. The Fram was ready for sea June 24, 1898, and left her moorings with the quay packed with people and the fjord covered with small craft, which had come to see the last of us and wish us a safe return home. Captain Sverdrup's original plan was to push through Kennedy and Robeson channels, and as far along the north coast of Greenland as possible before seeking winter quarters. The unfavorable seasons of 1898 to 1899 prevented him from carrying out his intentions, and he fortunately turned his attention to Jones Sound, which led to the completion of the most important Arctic work yet remaining, namely, the discovery of what was hitherto unknown in the wide gap between Prince Patrick Island and Aldrich's farthest. Frustrated in his attempt to enter Kane Basin, Sverdrup wintered in Rice Strait, west of Cape Sabine. Immediate preparations were made for passing the cold season, and scientific observations and exploring trips occupied the autumn. In describing the sun sinking out of sight Sunday, October 16, 1898, Sverdrup says, "We were looking at the sun for the last time that year. Its pale light lay dying over the inland ice. Its disk, light red, was veiled on the horizon. It was like a day in the land of the dead. All light was so hopelessly cold, all life so far away. We stood and watched it until it sank. Then everything became so still it made one shudder, as if the Almighty had deserted us and shut the gates of heaven. The light died away across the mountains and slowly vanished, while over us crept the great shades of the polar night, the night that kills all life. I think that each of us, as we stood there, felt his heart swell within him. Never before had we experienced homesickness like this, and little was said when we continued on our way. Here came Franklin with 138 men. The polar night stopped him, and not one returned. Here came Greeley with 25 men. 6 returned. Well, there lay the Fram, stout and defiant, like a little fairy house in the midst of the polar night. It was warm and bright in her cabins, and we worked with a will from morning to night. Sledge journeys, including a visit to the Windward, Lieutenant Peary's ship, and a personal interview with the explorer himself, visits to the Fram by neighboring Eskimos, and a brilliant journey across Ellesmere Land, occupied members of the Sverdrup expedition until May 17, 1899, when those on board the Fram celebrated with true patriotism the Independence Day of Norway. On one of the early summer sledge journeys, Dr. Johan Svensson sacrificed his life. Overrating his endurance, he had rapidly failed, and though he persisted in remaining in the field, his strength did not return. After a day's work, Sverdrup came into camp, where Schley and Simmons were cooking dinner. The doctor said he felt much better, writes Sverdrup. The pain in his side was gone, and his eyes had so far recovered that he could sit inside the tent without spectacles. I then asked him for a second time if he would not let me take him on board, now that we had all rested, but he would not hear of it and said that he should prefer to remain where he was. I then offered to stay behind with him. We could collect insects and shoot seals together, but he would not let me defer the journey to Jddykst Fjord, and said that the time would pass quickly, even when he was there alone. He could go out shooting, collect insects, and look after his dogs. He would have plenty to do. We got ready for our 4 days' trip to Jddykst Fjord, and the doctor helped us to carry down our things, lash the loads to the sledges, and harness the dogs. And then we said goodbye to one another, little thinking what was about to happen. 4 days later, the absent party returned. To our great sorrow, we found the doctor dead. On June 16, 1899, Captain Sverdrup made the entry in his journal. The flag is flying at half-mast from the pole today. It is the first time it has been in this position on board the Fram. Let us hope it will indeed be the last. The interesting journey across the inland ice of Ellesmere Land by Isaacson and Braskerud was undertaken May 23, 1899, with food for 30 days and instruments and equipment, a total weight of 872 pounds, divided equally upon the sledges, each drawn by 6 dogs. Choosing a route to the westward, Isaacson writes in his report, "About midnight on June 2, we saw from the high ground to the northwest the first sight of what later proved the west coast. It was a fjord arm, which cut into the land in an easterly direction from the larger fjord lying almost due north and south. From the outer part of this fjord arm, a chain of mountains of equal heights ran in a southeasterly direction. Nearer, and in front of this chain, was a wide level waste, Brakerdentlia. There was no snow either on the waste or on the mountains. In one part only of the chain was a fragment of glacier to be seen hanging over the upper part of the mountainside. In the southeast, the waste abutted immediately on the inland ice. Traveling over a glacier, they endeavored to reach the bare land of the fjord. This they succeeded in doing, June 4. 3 converging glaciers fell into a glacier lake, and the following day we drove on this down the valley, but only for a couple of miles, which was the extent of its length. The ice on it was about to break up. Having encamped, the 2 men rambled over a considerable area in the vicinity, finding luxuriant vegetation wherever there was bare land. At a distance some 10 or 11 miles in a northwesterly direction, there was no inland ice west of the northernmost glaciers previously mentioned. After continuing their explorations for several days, they were forced to return through continued bad weather, fogs, and gales. On June 22, the 30th day since leaving the ship, the food supply remaining was reduced to about 50 biscuits, 10½ tablets of compressed lentils, about 4 pounds of pemmican, enough coffee for twice, 6 whole rounds or 72 rations of dog food, and a half-gallon of petroleum. After a delay of 6 days by the inclement weather and a slow and difficult progress to the top of Leffert Glacier, it was with joy that a relief party from the ship were met with, and the following day we drove down Leffert Glacier on splendid snow, and reached the Fram on Sunday, July 2, at 5 in the morning. On August 4, the conditions being more favorable than heretofore, Captain Sverdrup endeavored to navigate the Fram through Kane Basin. In Peary Harbor, an American steamer was sighted going northeast. To the joy of all, the steamer signaled she had letters on board for the Norwegians. The attempt to penetrate Kane Basin was unsuccessful. The Fram was forced back to Falk Fjord, a short distance from one of Peary's ships. Captain Bartlett, Dr. Jddykst, and 1 or 2 other members of the expedition exchanged courtesies with the Norwegians. Mr. Bridgman and Professor Libby came aboard the Fram. It was learned that the mail brought north had been left at Peary Harbor. The Fram endeavored to get it, but the impenetrable pack prevented, and after the most desperate efforts they gave up in despair. It was at this juncture, after the abandonment of the plan to trace the northern extremity of Greenland, that Sverdrup transferred his base to the fjords of the north coast of Jones Sound. Securing no less than 33 walrus for dog food, the Fram established the second winter quarters at Havne Fjord in 96 degrees 29 minutes north, 84 degrees 25 minutes west. Game and seals were found in plenty during the autumn, also musk oxen, hares, and reindeer. Most successful scientific researches were promoted. Sledging parties continued explorations, and the only event to mar a happy autumn was the death of Braskerud. He had had a very bad cold and was ill a fortnight with a cough and had great difficulty in breathing, but had suffered no pain. There was no doctor, and nothing could be done to relieve him. He had kept his bed the last 3 days of his illness, and no one dreamed the end was so near. Preparations for the grand sledge journey of the spring kept the men busy during the winter, and early in the season Isaacson, Bay, Shea, and Stoltz, each man with a full load, went to examine the outlying depots placed the previous fall. At Bjornborg, the ravages of bears had caused loss of food and damaged equipment, and this serious menace to the success of the future journeys decided Captain Sverdrup to place a watchman at this lonely and isolated spot. Bay, the zoologist, volunteered for the duty and was appointed Commandant of Bjornborg. On March 7, writes Sverdrup, Fosheim and I started west in company with the newly appointed Commandant. A little after 12 the following day we arrived at the boathouse. After finishing our work, we had dinner which was as sustaining as it was splendid, and consisted of boiled beef, sausage, soup, and green peas. After dinner we had drams and coffee, and after supper, grog. Early next morning, and on good ice, we drove on, running by the side of the loads nearly the whole day to increase the pace. We reached Bjornborg in the evening, where we found our new depot was in good order. Next day we set to work on the erection of the Commandant's residence. We built a very respectable house. Like other residences of the kind, Bjornborg must have its flag, we thought, and as we were in possession of a flagstaff, which, considering our circumstances, was irreproachable, we secured it to the roof, and ran up a 17th of May flag. But our Commandant was economical, and would only use it on occasions of a special ceremony. Here Bay lived, absolutely alone for 3 months, and during the first part of the time without so much as a living being for company. Afterwards he had a garrison consisting of a whole watchdog. During all this long period, I never saw him out of spirits. The following day, Sverdrup and Fosheim made an examination of the ice, which in the fjords was rugged and hummocky. Upon the return to the ship, it was decided that Bandmann, leading the supporting party, should leave the ship Saturday, March 17, with full loads, with Bjornborg as their destination, returning thence to the boathouse to fetch provisions and dog food, which were to be used on the approaching journeys westward. For these journeys, Isaacson and Hassel were to make one party, Fosheim and Sverdrup the second, Shea and Petter the third. All were to meet at Bjornborg on March 21, later to separate and journey in different directions. The following rations were allotted to the different parties. Bandmann and his men, 240 days' rations, about 530 pounds. Isaacson and Hassel, 100 days' rations, about 220 pounds. Sverdrup and Fosheim, 100 days' rations, about 200 pounds. Shea and Petter, 80 days' rations, about 175 pounds. Bay, 90 days' rations, about 200 pounds. The great expedition upon which so much thought and care had been expended was ready to start, March 20, 1900. The weather was beautiful, writes Sverdrup, and we drove out through the Sound, east of Skreya, at a smart pace, taking, when south of it, a line direct for South Cape. On this journey, in which Sverdrup and Fosheim traced the west shore of Ellesmere Land to 80 degrees 50 minutes north, a serious yet amusing incident occurred. At certain places on our way, writes Sverdrup, we came across huge rocks, some of which were as big as a cottage, and round them the snow had drifted to such a height that we could only just see the top. When we came nearer, we found that, as a rule, the wind had hollowed out a large empty space between the drift, and we were often met by a yawning pitfall 12 to 18 feet in depth. I should mention that we were obliged to drive above the rocks, as below was the open sea. It once happened that, just as we were passing a rock of this kind, a gap occurred between my sledge and the one following it. As soon as I became aware of this, I pulled up, but almost before I knew what was taking place, the dogs had made their usual frantic rush to catch up, and the sledge, men, and team were precipitated into the hole 12 feet below. A moment afterwards, before anything could be done to prevent it, the next sledge came tearing up and fell into the hole, and on the heels of number 2 came a third, which followed their example. In the grave lay pell-mell 3 men, 18 dogs, and 3 sledges with their loads, and the snow was flying up from it in clouds. Here and there a sledge runner or a sealskin strap was sticking out. Then I saw one of the men crawling out of the medley and pulling himself together. Then another and another. Thank God they were all alive. And the dogs? They were lying in a black heap, one team on top of the other, kicking, howling, and fighting, till we could hardly hear the men's voices for their noise. So apparently they too were alive. As soon as we had hauled them all up, we set to work to shovel part of the drift away so that we could drag up the loads. The first sledge, which, after much toil, we succeeded in bringing up, strange to say, was whole, nor was there anything wrong with number 2, while number 3 was as intact as the 2 former. The very astonishing result of this flight through the air was, therefore, that not a limb, nor a lashing, nor bit of wood was broken. While the travelers were in the field pursuing their perilous and exciting adventures, the commandant at Bjornborg was leading a lonely and monotonous life, awaiting his chance to annihilate marauding Bruins. His first call to arms came soon after Captain Sverdrup's departure. Late one night, while half asleep, the commandant, at that time without a garrison, thought he heard a faint sound in the depot. I only turned round in the bag, he says, and inwardly cursed Hassel's dogs, which were loose again and ransacking the depot. I was on the point of falling asleep once more when it began to dawn on me that my reasoning had been wrong, for there were no dogs within many miles, and therewith I heard a crash, which seemed to make the earth tremble. A moment later I was out of the bag, had dragged my gun from its cover, and cocked it, for it suddenly occurred to me that my guest was a serious one. The first thing I did was to light the lamp, after which I began to move away some tins I had put in front of the door, that night for the first time, to keep it in place. The sound still continued at the depot, but in moving the last tin, I happened to make a slight noise, and then everything became as still as death. I raised the door and crept out. It was 1 o'clock. I had looked at my watch when I lit the lamp, and much darker than was pleasant for the work before me. The bear, meanwhile, had made itself quite at home. In order to get at one of the blubber cases, it had thrust the empty boxes out of its way, and had thrown down one of the dog food boxes which had been placed on the cases of blubber. The marks of all its claws were clearly visible in the tin. The other box was open, and the bear had tasted a couple of rations, but had evidently not found them to his liking, for he had spat them out again into the box. It had then very carefully lifted the tin down onto the snow, and then, also very carefully, raised the lid of the blubber box. But just as it was going to begin its meal, it had evidently heard my clatter inside the hut, and had sat down to listen, with its right paw clasping the edge of the box. It was in this position, at any rate, that I found it, when I raised myself up, after creeping out. The bear was about 15 yards away from me, and as soon as it saw me rose, large and fat and hissing, it made the open tin rattle as it put its left paw down on it. It looked just as if it were thumping the table to show what a fine fellow it was, and reminded me of one of my friends on board. So much so that I half unwittingly addressed it in the way usual between us, a manner, however, hardly fit for publication. Whether the bear felt offended at this, I know not, but certain it is that it got up and walked, growling, with long measured steps round the depot. I aimed and shot it in the shoulder. I could just discern the sights through the darkness. The bear uttered such a loud growl, continues the commandant, that it seemed to make the stillness ring. The fire from my gun had dazzled me, and I could no longer see the sights, and the bear itself I only saw as a shapeless mass, which seemed to have grown most incredibly larger. The other barrel, the small shot barrel, which was loaded with a large ball, I fired straight into the mass without going through any such formality as aiming. Then I made a well-ordered retreat behind the hut and put in some fresh cartridges. I do not much believe in hurrying, but I did this in less time than it takes to tell. To my great astonishment, I did not see anything, not that I wanted to, of my enemy during this operation, but as soon as I was ready, I began to peer about after it, though at first without success. At last, on bending down, I caught sight of a large dark object a short distance away at a spot where I knew there was no rock. This, of course, must be the bear, but whether dead or alive it was impossible to tell. I therefore advanced with much caution, and fired a shot at what I supposed to be its head. On closer examination it proved to be the other end of the bear I had bombarded. But as a zoologist, I, of course, knew that the head in Ursus maritimus is, as a rule, exactly at the opposite extremity to the after end of the animal, and at last really succeeded in giving it some lead in the right place. The bear had, no doubt, been dead for some time, but discretion is the better part of valor. I then realized that I had killed my first bear. To say that I was proud is nowhere near the mark. The commandant had other visits from bears while leading the hermit's life at Bjornborg, and the killing of a seal was also added to his achievements. On June 2, however, he left the castle where he had lived alone for almost a quarter of a year. It was not without a feeling of sadness, he writes, that I saw the last glimpse of the spot as we rounded the steep bluffs of Stormcap. For, although my life there had been solitary and monotonous enough, except on occasions when it had been extremely lively, I felt I was leaving a home where I knew every stone and every irregularity of the ground, a place I had known in calm and the glory of sunshine, as well as during the raging of the storms. And then, too, I had a feeling as if peace and quietness were at an end, for east of the Stormcap began for me the great busy world, which for so long now I had almost forgotten. A serious fire occurred on board the Fram, May 27, 1900. A spark from the galley falling upon the winter awning was supposed to be the cause of the conflagration. The loss of paraffin-prepared kayaks, a quantity of skis, and wood and other valuables were consumed, but the chief danger which threatened the safety of the ship and all on board was the proximity of the fire to an iron tank containing 50 gallons of spirit. So great was the heat of the fire that, though the tank held, the tinning on the outside was found melted. On August 9, after a summer of successful research, the conditions being favorable, Captain Sverdrup decided to push westward with the Fram. Through the ice-free sound all went well, he writes. But farther out, east of the rocks, we entered the ice, and lay there ramming the whole day long. Whenever we got a chance, we forged on full speed ahead, and when perforce we came to a standstill, we backed to get an impetus, and gave another ram. Skirting the coast, the Fram pushed her difficult course to within about 1.5 miles from North Devon, where on September 3, 1900, the ship was made ready for her third winter in the Arctic. On the 15th, a storm disrupted the pack, and quick action on the part of officers and men was required to prepare the Fram for the opening of the ice which suddenly released her. As quickly as possible she was bearing toward Cardigan Strait, and steered through in easy waters, finally anchoring in the good winter harbor of Gasfjord. The land in the vicinity of this harbor was rich in game, fauna, and interesting fossils. Captain Sverdrup describes a curious experience while out hunting. In a small valley he discovered countless hare tracks, which crossed and recrossed one another in every direction, the snow in places having been trodden in hard runs. Calling his telescope to his aid, he made out what he had mistaken for a group of white stones a short distance off to be a group of Arctic hares, 31 in number, evidently at rest, with one plainly acting as sentinel. Although Sverdrup approached with great caution, the hare on guard suddenly took alarm and, starting up, ran wildly round her flock, striking her hind legs on the ground till it fairly resounded, then setting off at a brisk pace over the ridge of a hill, the others following in a long line and presently disappearing. At a short distance, 2 others, evidently not belonging to the other lot, remained by themselves. I thought, writes Sverdrup, it would be interesting to go across to them if possible and see what they were about, but realized I must make use of other tactics if I would approach near them. This, I thought, was a fitting moment to impersonate a reindeer or some other kind of big game, and I made a valiant attempt to simulate their grazing movements backwards and forwards on the sward. My tactics were so successful that, in the end, I was not much more than 2 or 3 yards away from them. It was quite touching to see these great innocent Arctic hares, sitting only a few paces off, quietly gnawing roots. The only notice they vouchsafed me was an occasional sniff in my direction. I stayed long fraternizing with the hares down on the grass, and at last we did not mind each other in the very least. They went on with their occupations quite unconcernedly, I with mine. I felt something like Adam in paradise before Eve came, and all that about the serpent happened. Hunting expeditions and autumnal sledge journeys at an end, the winter set in with plenty of work to do for everyone on board the Fram. The smithy was called upon for endless labor. The taking of observations and the many other daily occupations caused the long Arctic night to pass with less monotony and depression. A visitation from wolves added excitement to the winter, and various methods were tried for their capture. The explorations of 1901 proved Heiberg Land to be an island, separated by Eureka Strait. This was explored as far as its junction with Greely Fjord, but another year remained before the Norwegian standard was carried to 81 degrees, 37 minutes north, 92 degrees west, where it was raised May 13, 1902, and the outline of coast completed to Aldrich's farthest. Having made one of the most brilliant records in Arctic history, the members of the Fram's second polar expedition turned toward their native land, and on August 6, 1902, the Fram began her triumphant retreat from the great white north. Homeward. What a strange ring in the simple word, cries Captain Sverdrup. On our long and laborious sledge journeys, we had many a time used it when we thought of the Fram, and a good home the Fram had been these 4 years, warm and strong and well provided. But that was in another way. Now the longing for home coursed through our blood, and all the yearning, which we had thrust aside during these long years, broke loose, rang in our ears, and made our hearts beat faster. Half-forgotten memories and dawning hopes came back again. A sea of thoughts streamed in on us and tied our tongues in the midst of the joy at going home. It was a moment full of promise when we knew that we were looking for the last time on these mountains and fjords which for so long had been the object and scene of our endeavor. September 26, the Fram reached Kristiansand, and 2 days later she dropped anchor for a few hours at Langrenden off Horten. Quite a fleet of steamers and sailing boats escorted her from Stavanger to Christiania, which was reached on a beautiful Sunday, which recalled to us the day 4 years since when we had gone the other way. So the Fram's second polar expedition was at an end, concludes Captain Sverdrup. An approximate area of 100,000 square miles had been explored, and in the name of the Norwegian king, taken possession of. If the members of the expedition have been able to do anything, this is owing, in the first instance, to the sacrifices of generous Norwegians. That we have not done more is, at any rate, not owing to want of will. The successful navigation of the long-sought Northwest Passage by Captain Roald Amundsen has been one of the stirring events of the early 20th century. Of this hardy Norseman and what he accomplished, Mr. Alger gives an interesting account in Putnam's Magazine. Born July 16, 1872, at Borg, in the district of Smalenene, southern Norway, he comes from an old seafaring family and has had much experience as a sailor. As an officer, he took part in the Belgian South Pole expedition of 1897 on board the Belgica, and it was down in the Antarctic regions that he first planned his famous Arctic voyage. On the whaler Gjoa, a ship of only 46 tons, he left Christiania in May 1903 with a crew of 7 men, and 3 years later, in the summer of 1906, the news was spread over the world that he had accomplished what no man before him had succeeded in doing. He had not only sailed through the Northwest Passage, but had located the magnetic pole and otherwise gathered much scientific information of the greatest value in regard to these little-known regions. The Gjoa was especially strengthened and refitted throughout. She was amply provisioned for 5 years, and her crew most carefully selected. Second in command was Lieutenant Godfred Hansen of the Danish Navy. First mate Otto Lund of Tromsø had had long years of service in the sealing trade. Petter Ristrad, a sergeant in the Norwegian Army, was first engineer. Helmer Hansen, also an experienced sealer, a good snowshoer and hunter, was second mate. Gustav Juel, second engineer, was to take part in the magnetic observations, but he died on the trip from pneumonia in March 1906. Adolf Lindström served as cook, having served in the same capacity aboard the Fram. Sailing at midnight, June 16, 1903, from Christiania, Cape Farewell, Greenland, was sighted 5 weeks later. Securing 10 fine dogs at Godhaven from Herr Dangad Jensen, inspector for North Greenland, they entered Melville Bay August 8. On August 15, they came in sight of Dalrymple Rock. At this point, 2 Scotch whaling captains, Milne and Adams, had deposited certain stores for Amundsen. The Gjoa was unexpectedly met in kayaks by members of the Danish literary Greenland expedition, Herr Milius Eriksson and Herr Knut Rasmussen. An exchange of courtesies was followed by the loading of the Gjoa with the packages from Dalrymple Rock. Pushing through the lanes at full steam, they emerged into open water in Baffin Bay and later entered Lancaster Sound, anchoring at Beachy August 22. On August 24, they pushed into Peel Sound. The efficiency of the compass now ceased, and they were compelled to navigate by the stars whenever they appeared through the fog which prevailed most of the time. Passing along the west coast of Boothia, Felix, They came to grief by grounding on September 1 and were obliged to lighten the ship by throwing overboard the greater part of the deck cargo. On Saturday, September 12, entered Gjoa Harbor, a small landlocked cove at the head of Peterson Bay, King William Land, and here they remained for nearly 2 years. Immediate preparations were made for wintering, provisions landed, observatories erected, and Amundsen at once began his valuable scientific observations. In order to ensure accuracy, writes General Greeley in the Century, 1907, the magnetic instruments were installed in temporary wooden buildings built with copper nails and entirely free of any iron, heat, or even light, except the lamp behind the reflector. Here, day and night, for 20 months, were made photographed records, and these were supplemented by personal eye readings to serve as needful checks on those photographically obtained. The observers in this work were clothed entirely in deerskin garments, and before entering the building where the magnetometers were installed, carefully divested themselves of watches, keys, knives, and other metallic objects. The observations were made in winter under such conditions of cold, monotony, and darkness as to merit the highest commendation for endurance and constancy. And he continues, the value of the continuous observations at Gjoa Harbor was largely increased by similar observations in the field, which necessarily entailed severe exposure and consequent hardships on the sledging parties. In March 1904, a preliminary journey, made for the purpose of establishing food depots, involved much suffering owing to excessive cold, the temperature falling to 79 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. The sledge journey to the magnetic pole itself was made by Amundsen and Ristvedt, starting April 2, 1904, with 10 dogs and 2 sledges, much difficulty resulting from rough ice. 5 observation stations were occupied between Gjoa Harbor and Tasmania Islands, which are about 80 miles directly north of Ross's magnetic pole. This field work occupied about 2 months, being summarily finished at the end of May owing to loss of food through the thieving Jddykst of eastern Boothia. While no definite result of the field observations can yet be given, it is not thought that there has been any decided change from the magnetic conditions observed by Ross in 1831, when the pole of declination was in the neighborhood of Cape Adelaide, 70 degrees 5 minutes north, 96 degrees 44 minutes west. On April 1, 1905, Lieutenant Hansen and Ristvedt, with 2 sledges, 12 dogs, and provisions for 3 months, visited Victoria, and after charting half of the missing coastline, returned June 24. Neighbors were not lacking these isolated white men. Frequent visits from Eskimos and the news of American fishermen to the south permitted of letters being forwarded by Eskimos. On August 14, 1906, all conditions being favorable, the Gjoa weighed anchor and proceeded westward in open water, and within a few hours had successfully passed through Edda Sound, the narrowest place in the Northwest Passage, a tortuous channel between Edda Island and the mainland. The following day they threaded their way through a group of newly discovered islands and shallows that constantly necessitated the use of the lead. A heavy pack was encountered in Victoria Strait, but they continued on their way through the strait between Victoria Land and the mainland, thence through Dease Strait and Coronation Gulf, out into Dolphin and Union Straits, and on the morning of August 25 sighted Nelson Head, a tall and imposing headland. Having successfully passed from the Atlantic side into the Pacific side, the Gjoa had the good fortune to speak on the same day the American whaling schooner Charles Hanson from San Francisco. A delay of 24 hours was caused by the ice off Cape Bathurst. Near Bailey Island, several beset whalers were encountered, and the barks Alexander and Bowhead were sighted off Pullen Island. Cape Sabine was reached September 2, but progress was only made to King Point, about 35 miles east of Herschel Island, where the Joa was forced to put in another Arctic winter. On October 13, Amundsen, with a sledge and 5 dogs, made a journey of 5 months' duration, covering a distance of 1,500 miles to Eagle City, Alaska. This included a 2-month sojourn in Eagle City, when all dispatches were forwarded and mails received for himself and other members of the expedition. The following August, the Joa was freed, but on the 19th of that month, she received a bad injury to her propeller by grounding on a piece of ice, so continued her journey entirely under sail. She arrived at San Francisco October 19 with a rich cargo of ethnographical, zoological, and botanical specimens, and many furs and curios. These were freighted to Christiania, the Joa taken charge of by Admiral Lyons, Commandant of the Mare Island Navy Yard, and Amundsen and his companions started by rail for home. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of The Great White North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Katerina. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 23. Robert E. Peary, the man. First visit to the Arctic, 1886. Other journeys, 1891. Independence Bay, Greenland. Discovers Melville Land and Helprin Land. Subsequent journeys 1893 through 1895. Discovery of famous Iron Mountain. Summer voyages 1896 to 1897. North Pole journey of 1898. Peary seriously disabled by frostbites. Polar expedition in SS Roosevelt 1905 through 1906. Final dash for the pole 1908. For nearly a quarter of a century, the name of Robert Edwin Peary has been closely identified with Arctic work. No man in the history of exploration has renewed his attacks upon the impassable barriers of the Great White North with such perseverance, endurance, and determination. Again and again, in the face of disappointments, bodily disablements, failures, and discouragements that would have blasted the most sanguine hopes of the average man, he has persisted in his endeavors, returned to the field of action, fought gallantly the disheartening fight, come back to receive the polite indifference or enthusiastic praise of his countrymen, turned his energies to raising the necessary funds to renew his enterprise, and when this was done, faced to the north and passed again beyond the Arctic Circle. He is typically American, tall, lean, wiry, muscular, keen-eyed, alert, positive, and possessed of that indomitable will which conquers or dies. Born in Crescent, Pennsylvania, May 6, 1856, he had early the misfortune to lose his father, and his widowed mother, with a boy of 3, returned to her relatives and friends in New England and made her home in Portland, Maine. Here Peary the lad grew up, fond of the sea and the woods, loving the wild roar of the ocean as it beat upon the rocky coast, or the gentle summer winds whispering amid the northern pines. He loved to roam, to explore, to find adventure, and to lead others to it, and in his schoolboy days he was noted for his athletic tastes and powers of endurance. At 21 years of age he completed his college life at Bowdoin, graduating second in a class of 51, and 4 years later had passed the examinations which made him civil engineer in the United States Navy. From duty in Florida he was transferred to the Nicaragua Canal Zone, where he remained engaged in the Inter-Ocean Ship Canal Survey from 1884 to 1885. He returned under government orders to Washington in the fall of that year, and during a leisure hour in an old bookstore, he accidentally came upon a paper on the inland ice of Greenland. Remembering the adventures of Dr. Kane, which had thrilled him as a boy, and reading the experiences of Nordenskjöld, Jensen, and the rest, Peary felt he must know for himself what was the truth of this great mysterious interior. Thus early had the seed of ambition to explore the land of the mysterious North germinated in his active mind. The following year he received permission from the Department for leave of absence to make a reconnaissance of the Greenland ice cap, east of Disco Bay, 70 degrees north latitude. Accompanied by Christian Maygard, a Dane and 8 natives, Peary examined the coast and fjords, penetrated the inland ice, and visited, among other interesting spots, the Tosukatek Glacier, the base of Narrowsoak Peninsula, and the fossil beds of Atankut Loch. Here, he says, I found fragments of trees, black petrifications with the grain of the wood and the texture of the bark showing clearly. Pieces of sandstone split readily into sheets, between which were to be seen sharp, clear impressions of large net-veined leaves, every tiniest veinlet and minute serratum of the edges distinct as the lines of a steel engraving. Long, slender, parallel-veined leaves in exquisite feathery forms. Full of enthusiasm for further adventure in the land of desolation, where the wild vivid poppy flourishes in sheltered nooks near eternal glaciers, where a lifeless desert of perpetual snow from 5,000 to 10,000 feet above the level of the sea extends over an area of some 1,200 miles in length and 500 in width, a glistening shroud, covering the mighty rocks of ages, the buried summits of high mountains thousands of feet below. Peary returned to the United States, and in a newspaper article attracted the attention of the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Sciences, which offered to defray part of the expense of his second expedition. Peary left June 6, 1891, in the Kite, and with his party, including Mrs. Peary, Langdon Gibson, ornithologist and hunter, Dr. Frederick A. Cook, surgeon, Eyvind Astrup, a Norwegian, John M. Verhoff, mineralogist and meteorologist, and Matthew Henson, a colored man, landed at McCormick Bay in August. An unfortunate accident aboard the Kite, which resulted in a broken leg, caused Peary disappointment and delay in carrying out his autumn plans. However, Red Cliff House was erected, communications with the natives established, and such work carried on as Peary's unfortunate condition would permit. In April 1892, Peary, being fully restored to health, left Red Cliff House and explored Inglefield Gulf. His next move was to establish caches of provisions to be used on a sledge journey across the ice cap. This journey was undertaken in May. 4 sledges, to which were harnessed 16 dogs, carried the provisions and equipment. A supporting party advanced with Peary to a point about 100 miles from McCormick Bay. The explorer, with one companion, Astrup, proceeded over the great ice at an elevation of about 5,000 feet, and by May 31st looked down into Paterman Fjord. Here, says Peary, we were on the ice bluffs forming the limit of the great glacier basin, just as we had been at Humboldt, but a trifle less fortunate here than at Humboldt. I found it necessary to deflect some 10 miles to the eastward, to avoid the inequalities of the glacier basin, and the great crevasses which cut the ice bluffs encircling it. Peary's object now was to make the east coast of Greenland, following the edge of the ice cap, beset with crevices, slippery ice, hummocks, drifting snow and fogs, and the journey was continued until July 4, 1892, when they reached Independence Bay, 81 degrees 37 minutes north latitude. An ascent of Navy Cliff revealed a magnificent panorama of rugged, majestic, ice-free country to the north, and the broad expanse of the East Greenland Ocean. Strange it seemed that in this remote country in sheltered nooks the flowers bloomed, the hum of bees, the drone of flies fell upon the ear. The snow bunting, the sandpiper, a Greenland falcon, and a pair of ravens greeted the adventurers. Musk ox fed upon the patches of greensward, and no less than 5 fell to Peary's rifle and supplied men and dogs with abundant meat. The return journey back to McCormick Bay, a distance of some 450 miles, was made over the ice cap in the face of violent storms and wind, through drifts and fog, with diminished provisions and failing dogs. A joyful meeting with Professor Halprin and party, who had come north a month before with a Kite, took place on the inland ice, at the head of McCormick Bay, and a happy return was made to Red Cliff House. The results of Peary's second voyage to the Arctic, embracing the great 1,200-mile journey, determined the northern extension and insularity of Greenland, made the discovery of detached ice-free landmasses of less extent to the northward, and established the rapid convergence of the Greenland shores above the 78th parallel. It also included the discovery of Melville Land and Halprin Land, and the accumulation of most valuable scientific data, besides laying the foundation for Peary's comprehensive study of the Greenland Highlanders or native Eskimo. Immediately upon his return to the United States, Peary devoted his energies to a lecture tour from which he hoped to derive the necessary funds to promote a more extended exploration of northeast Greenland. Granted 3 years' leave of absence by the Honorary B.F. Tracy, Secretary of the Navy, the North Greenland expedition of 1893 to 1894 sailed on the Falcon, June 1893, and entered the mouth of Bowdoin Bay in Inglefield Gulf August 3rd. Here a house was rapidly constructed, stores landed, the Falcon making a brief trip after the winter supply of meat with a stop at Lifeboat Cove, where a visit was made to the site of Polaris House. A few relics were picked up bearing the stamp of the United States Navy Yard at Washington, dated 1865 to 1870. The 20th of August, after her return to the station at Bowdoin Bay, the Falcon steamed south, leaving the little group of 14 persons, including, among others, Mr. and Mrs. Peary, Mr. Samuel J. Entrekin, Avent Astrup, Dr. Edward E. Vincent, Mr. E. B. Baldwin, Mrs. Susan J. Cross, and the colored man, Matthew Hansen. On September 12, in this faraway land, the famous Snow Baby was born, little blue-eyed Marie Aniguito Peary, and bundled deep in soft, warm Arctic furs and wrapped in the Stars and Stripes. In early March 1894, the last preparations were completed for a second 1,200-mile journey across the Greenland ice cap. On the 6th of the month, accompanied by 8 men, 12 sledges, and 92 dogs, Peary ascended the inland ice. The advance of such a caravan was slow and heavy. The dogs of the various teams, being unaccustomed to one another, were constantly fighting. The penetrating cold nipped with frostbites the hands and feet of these men, so that after an advance of 134 miles, at an elevation of 5,500 feet, Peary determined at the end of 13 days to cache surplus stores, send back the majority of his men, and proceed with 3 men alone. But the conditions of cold and storms were too adverse for human endurance, the thermometer reaching as low as negative 60 degrees. The dogs were reduced to a most pitiable condition, many dying from exposure. On April 10, having advanced only about 85 miles, Peary decided it was inadvisable to attempt to proceed and prepared for his return to Bowdoin Bay. Abandoning and caching all unnecessary impedimenta, with only 26 dogs remaining out of the original number, the party reached the station in a much enfeebled and reduced state. Though temporarily defeated in the main object of his enterprise, Peary had gleaned much information concerning the famous Iron Mountain of Melville Bay, first mentioned by Captain Ross in 1818, and as part of the program he had laid down for himself, a visit to that interesting spot was undertaken. On May 27, 1894, Peary located this remarkable meteorite, leaving a cairn with records at a short distance from the spot. In the meantime, Astrup had made a successful sledge journey in reconnaissance of Melville Bay, and carefully charting much of its hitherto little-known northeastern shore. The last of July, the Falcon, with a party of scientists aboard, including, among others, Professor T.C. Chamberlain, Professor Wim Libby, Jr., H.L. Bridgman, and Mrs. Peary's brother, Emil Dibbich, anchored in McCormick Bay. After a sojourn in northern waters, they returned to the United States, carrying on board the entire Peary party, with the exception of the indomitable leader and 2 companions, Lee and Hansen. Peary's resources were limited. Food and fuel were reduced so as to menace future activities, and the visit of a relief ship in the summer of 1895 depended practically upon Mrs. Peary's sole exertions. Nevertheless, Peary determined to remain, and, immediately enlisting the natives to assist him, he drew on the country for his supplies. The fall was occupied in the chase after reindeer and Arctic hare for human food and walrus meat for the dogs, and later in examination and rehabilitation of the nearer caches of provisions left on the inland ice. The monotonous winter passed, and as the spring advanced, the day of departure approached for the next great journey across the Greenland ice. On April 2, 1895, the little band, consisting of its intrepid leader, with Lee and Hansen, 4 natives, and the 6 sledges with their dog teams, started northward. The fierce storms of winter had obliterated the marked caches. In vain was the immediate neighborhood scoured in every direction, sometimes to a distance of 5 miles. No signs of the looked-for depots could be discovered. Though Eskimos deserted and turned back, Peary still pushed on, at last left with only the 2 companions, some 40 dogs, and 3 sledges. The prospect was indeed dismal. Lee became disabled by frostbites, the dogs died, the gaunt form of starvation loomed on the horizon. May 8th, Lee could proceed no farther and was left in camp, distant some 16 miles from the coast, while Peary and Hansen advanced in the desperate search for game. 4 days and nights death by starvation faced them in the fruitless search for food. Then, disappointed, back to camp and a desperate march to Independence Bay. Then down the tortuous valley, across rocks, cobble, and boulder, the men plunged on. "A few miles beyond the valley, I saw a fresh hare track," says Peary, "and a few 100 yards beyond came upon the hare itself, squatting among the rocks a few paces distant. With the sight of the beautiful spotless little animal, the feeling of emptiness in the region of my stomach increased. I called to Matt, who was some little distance back, to stop the dogs and come up with his rifle. He was so affected by the prospect of a good supper, his first and second bullets missed the mark, but at the third the white object collapsed into a shapeless mass, and on the instant gaunt hunger leapt upon us like a wolf upon its prey. It was the first full meal we had had since the Eskimos left us 35 days ago." Later musk ox fell to the hunter's aim, which restored courage and strength to the desperate men. They reached the cairn which Peary had erected in 1892 and found the papers there still intact. To linger in the vicinity meant a constant consumption of food for which they were not prepared. There was yet the long journey back over the dread ice cap, 8,000 feet above the level of the sea. With 9 dogs and food for 17 days only, they retraced their steps, fleeing in forced marches from that ever-present gaunt form, starvation, closing upon their wake. One by one the faithful dogs died by the wayside. This retreat over the great ice is one of the most desperate struggles in Arctic history. At last, June 25, the 3 starving, exhausted men reached Bowdoin Bay. At the beginning of the last day there were left 4 biscuits, saved from the half and quarter rations of the preceding weeks, and 1 dog was still alive, the sole survivor of a pack of 42. "Poor brute," says Peary. "The memory of those famine days upon the great ice remained so vividly with him that for weeks after our return, though weak and afflicted like ourselves, he might be seen at any time when not asleep, hiding away every bit of meat or blubber and every bone that he could find about the place." A few weeks of recuperation fitted the men for the journey home, and relief ship Kite, in charge of Captain Bartlett, reached them in early August. In 1896 and 1897, Peary made 2 summer voyages to the Arctic for the purpose of transferring to the United States the largest of the 3 Cape York meteorites. On the first trip, he was successful in dislodging this 90-ton mass from the ice grip of centuries, but was compelled to leave it until the next season, when he successfully had it transferred to the hold of the Hope, the Peary ship of that year, and the World Wonder now reposes in the Museum of Natural History, New York City. During these active years, Peary had made warm friends, men who had said to him with the same confidence expressed by Theodore Roosevelt, "I believe in you, Peary," and the Peary Arctic Club was formed, headed by that generous benefactor, Morris K. Jessup, as president, Frederick E. Hyde, vice president, Henry W. Cannon, treasurer, and Herbert L. Bridgman, secretary, and others to lend encouragement and financial aid. Peary's ambitions had not been satisfied by his brilliant achievements in twice crossing the Greenland ice cap, and the lure of the Arctic had long beckoned him to try to reach the northernmost extremity of the earth. His journey of 1898 to 1902 under the auspices of the Peary Arctic Club had for its main purpose the attainment of the pole itself. His carefully laid plan was to advance toward the pole by the west coast of Greenland and establish food stations, depending upon picked Eskimos for cooperation with his small party. In the final dash, supporting sledges would be sent back as soon as emptied, and the returning explorer with 2 companions would be met by a relief party of Eskimos. Mr. Harmsworth of London generously gave his yacht, the Windward, for this expedition. Peary started with every prospect of success. The Windward endeavored to force a passage into Kennedy Channel, but was obliged to seek shelter in winter quarters at Cape Dorval. In earlier autumnal journeys, Peary determined the continuity of Ellesmere and Grinnell lands, and prepared to make his headquarters at Fort Conger. In January 1899 came a sudden and most disheartening setback to his ambitious plans. While on this dangerous sledge journey, in a frightful temperature that ranged between 51 to 63 degrees below zero, he had both feet badly frozen, and this grave injury, which nearly cost him his life, resulted in the amputation of 8 toes, but not before weeks of suffering had been passed in the melancholy winter darkness at Greely's old quarters. "During the following weeks," writes Peary, "our life at Conger was pronouncedly a la Robinson Crusoe. Searching for things in the unbroken darkness of the great night with a tiny flicker of flame in a saucer was very like seeking a needle in a haystack." At last, on the 18th of February, in the moonlight, they started back to the ship. Lashed firmly down, with feet and legs wrapped in musk ox skin, Peary was dragged in the cold Arctic night, a distance of 250 miles in 11 days. Disheartening weeks of inaction and suffering aboard the Windward but partially restored his health. Nevertheless, in April, while still on crutches, he was dragged on sledges to Fort Conger. This season was passed in scientific work and map-making. While crossing Ellesmere Land ice cap in July at an elevation of 7,000 feet, Peary discovered Cannon Bay. Other results of his indefatigable endeavors were the collecting of relics of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, which were sent home by the Windward. The sextant and record of the Nares expedition were also found and sent back to be presented to the Lords of the Admiralty of Great Britain and placed in the Museum of the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. Each season a vessel was sent to Greenland to carry him supplies and bring back letters. Small parties of scientists, university students, and hunters took advantage of the opportunity to sail north and be left at various points to be called for on the vessel's return. In 1899, Dr. Robert Stein of the United States Geological Survey, Dr. Leopold Ken of Cornell, and Mr. Samuel Warmbath had taken passage in the Peary supply ship Diana for explorations in Ellesmere Land. In the fall of 1899, the Windward returned to the United States, leaving Peary in Etah, where he remained until the following March, when he journeyed to Fort Conger and from there made his northern dash in an attempt to reach the pole. The explorer followed closely the route laid down by Brainerd and Lockwood, and on May 8 beat their record. Later he reached the most northern point of land, to which he gave the name of Cape Morris K.G. sub, 83 degrees 39 minutes north. From this point his travel was over the disintegrating polar pack, in advance of ridges of heavy ice thrown up to heights of 25 to 50 feet, crevices and holes masked by snow, the whole intersected by narrow leads of open water. Having reached 83 degrees 54 minutes north, he then returned to Cape Morris G sub and followed the coast of Melville Land for some distance, then returned south. In 1901 he attempted another northern journey, but found advance impossible after reaching Lincoln Bay. Undaunted by failure, his next attempt was made in February 1902 and reached April 21st, 84 degrees 17 minutes north, but again he was forced back after risking his own life and that of his companions over the worst ice he had ever encountered. Momentarily discouraged, he wrote at this time, "The game is off. My dream of 16 years is ended. I have made the best fight I knew. I believe it has been a good one, but I cannot accomplish the impossible." After 4 years of strenuous endeavor in the face of the most disheartening failure, Peary came back to the United States, took courage once more, renewed the losing fight, and planned his 7th voyage into the Arctic. Under the auspices of the Peary Arctic Club, a model ship was built for the sole purpose of assisting Peary in accomplishing the work upon which he had set his heart, lavished his fortune, and staked the confidence of his friends. The result was the building of the Roosevelt, the most modern of ice fighters. The plans for the Roosevelt allowed a length of 184 by 35 feet beam and 16 feet draft, loaded. She was provided with engines capable of developing 1,000 horsepower. She carried a light 3-masted schooner rig. Her hull was especially designed to resist the terrific pressure of the ice floes and of such shape to lift easily from the treacherous ice cradles in which she was expected to test her resisting qualities. In this splendid craft, Peary started north in 1905 and boldly plowed the Roosevelt farther than any vessel had yet penetrated, reaching nearly 82 degrees 30 minutes north latitude on the north coast of Grant Land. The Roosevelt wintered at Cape Sheridan, and from this high latitude Peary started in February 1906 for the pole. Everything seemed favorable: improved equipment, Eskimo assistant, well-laid caches, and Peary himself full of the eternal vigor which, in spite of years of hardship, gave to his mind and body the elasticity of youth. On, across the interminable obstacles. On, past one degree and then another, with the ever-present problem of cold, storm, rough ice, and diminishing food, until finally the forces of nature baffled once again the forces of human strength. At 87 degrees 6 minutes, the uncompromising voices of the north cried out, "This far shalt thou come, and no farther." Back once more, step by step, over hummock, crevice, and floe, over thin and treacherous ice, across the big lead whose thin, undulating surface, some 2 miles in width, barely supported the weight of a man in his frantic race with death. Back once more to the south, baffled once more in his schemes, but sterner than ever in the purpose to die or win, because the thing he has set himself to do is a part of his being. Peary returned to the United States, the plans of his 8th and final journey already maturing in his mind. The Roosevelt was docked for the purpose of repairs. Funds for this last journey were slow in forthcoming. Every expedient was tried, but, though a substantial sum was raised, there still lacked money to complete the work, provision and equip the expedition, and to pay the current expenses of the trip. In the midst of these perplexing problems, Peary received another blow in the news of the death of Mr. Morris K. Jessup, his most liberal supporter. With his death all seemed lost. The darkest hour of discouragement had come. Delays of months meant perhaps the delay of years, or possibly the entire abandonment of this last voyage, the voyage of the forlorn hope. Proverbially, the darkest hour is just before dawn, and the Peary Arctic Club, under its new president, General Thomas H. Hubbard, received a liberal check, tendered by Mr. Zenas Crane, the paper manufacturer of Massachusetts, which suddenly rent asunder the somber clouds and showed once more their silver lining. Relieved of the mental anxiety which had been his constant companion for months, Peary now hurried his final preparations, and, rejoicing in his good fortune, steamed out of New York Harbor July 6, 1908, in the gallant Roosevelt, with her pennants flying bravely to the breeze. Peary, now grown old in Arctic service, sailed to the Great White North, this time to reach his goal. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Great White North. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Brandon Mitchell. The Great White North by Helen S. Wright. Chapter 24. Dr. Frederick A. Cook claims discovery of the pole. His return from the Arctic. Reception by the Danes. Announcement of conquest of the pole by Peary. Denounces Dr. Cook. Delay of Dr. Cook to produce his data. Acceptance of Peary's claims by the American Geographical Society. Dr. Cook finally sends manuscript to Copenhagen. Verdict. Prior claim to the discovery of the North Pole, not proven. The announcement in the New York Herald on September 1, 1909 of the discovery of the North Pole by Dr. Frederick A. Cook of Brooklyn, New York, astounded the civilized world. For some years, Dr. Cook's name had been associated with Arctic enterprise, but to the majority of the public his name was strange. In the summer of 1907, Cook had accompanied Mr. John R. Bradley in the gentleman's yacht in an excursion after big game beyond the Arctic Circle. Later, Mr. Bradley sailed home, leaving Cook with a fair supply of provisions and equipment and one white companion, a German-American named Frankie. On March 8, 1908, Cook left Anuktok accompanied by 11 men and 103 dogs with the avowed purpose of reaching the pole. Frankie remained at Anuktok with instructions to return to the United States in case Cook did not return by June 1908. News of Cook's departure for the North Pole had meanwhile aroused interest in the United States. One of the objects of Commander Peary's expedition of 1908 was the relief and rescue of Dr. Frederick A. Cook. The big supply station at Etah was, in fact, established by him mainly for the benefit of Dr. Cook. When the Roosevelt and the Eric arrived at Anuktok in August 7, 1908, Frankie was found in a pitiable condition and he begged to be sent home. He was returned in the Eric, commanded by Captain Bartlett, and from St. John's, Newfoundland, sent out the news that Cook had probably perished on his way to the pole. This announcement aroused so much interest that early in August 1909, a relief ship left St. John's for the purpose of searching for Dr. Cook and for carrying provisions to Peary. News traveled slowly north of 53, and meanwhile, Cook had returned. In April 1909, a white man and 2 Eskimos appeared at the relief station at Anuktok, the station immediately north of Etah. The 3 were utterly fatigued and were made as comfortable as possible by the men whom Commander Peary had left behind. A few days later, Cook left Anuktok for South Greenland, whence he took steamer for Copenhagen. Dispatches from the Shetland Islands the last of August 1909 proclaimed that Dr. Cook had reached the pole in April 1908. Cook declared his route to have been by Smith Sound across Ellesmere Land to Nansen Sound to Land's End, thence by Cape Thomas Hubbard, which he left in March 1908, to the pole 460 miles distant, which he claims to have reached on April 21, 1908. The familiar story of his welcome at Copenhagen needs not to be retold here. Meanwhile came a dispatch to the New York Times. I have the pole, April 6. Expect arrive Chateau Bay, September 7. Secure control wire for me there and arrange expedite transmission. Big story. Peary. At Battle Harbor, Commander Peary learned of Cook's claim to have reached the pole. But Peary had carried northward a number of Eskimos with their wives and children, and those he had led safely back again to Etah. However, the Greenland winter was approaching, and he lingered at Etah, organizing a walrus hunt which supplied his faithful company with food for the coming year. Not till this provision was made did he set his face toward the United States. A shadow of doubt hardly bigger than a man's hand, which was cast by part of the scientific world at the doctor's first announcement, soon grew into what eventually proved to be a cloudburst. No controversy in the history of modern times has caused more general excitement. Soon the two principals were pursuing their separate activities under very dissimilar conditions. Dr. Cook was lecturing in the United States, facing packed houses, interviewing reporters, asserting his claims, promising proofs of his assertion. Peary preferred to present his own claims to the discovery of the pole in terse language, the first announcement published in the New York Times, reading, Summary of North Polar Expedition of the Peary Arctic Club. The steamer Roosevelt left New York on August 6, 1908, left Sydney July 17, arrived at Cape York, Greenland, August 1. Left Etah, Greenland, August 8. Arrived Cape Sheridan at Grantland, September 1. Wintered at Cape Sheridan. The sledge expedition left the Roosevelt February 15, 1909, and started for the north. Arrived at Cape Columbia, March 1. Passed British record, March 2. Delayed by open water, March 2 and 3. Held up by open water, March 4 to 11. Crossed the 84th parallel, March 11. Encountered open lead, March 15. Crossed 85th parallel, March 18. Crossed 86th parallel, March 23. Encountered open lead, March 23. Passed Norwegian record, March 23. Passed Italian record, March 24. Encountered open lead, March 26, crossed 87th parallel, March 27. Passed American record, March 28. Encountered open lead, March 28. Held up by open water, March 29. Crossed 88th parallel, April 2. Crossed 89th parallel, April 4. North Pole, April 6th. All returning left North Pole, April 7. Reached Cape Columbia, April 23. Arriving on board Roosevelt, April 27. The Roosevelt left Cape Sheridan, July 18, passed Cape Sabine, August 8, left Cape York, August 26, arrived at Indian Harbor with all members of the expedition returning in good health, except Professor Ross G. Marvin, unfortunately drowned April 10 when 45 miles north of Cape Columbia, returning from 86 degrees north latitude in command of the supporting party. Robert E. Peary. Immediately upon his return to the United States, Peary joined his family at their summer home in Maine, offering to submit his proofs at once to any competent body. The National Geographic Society, accepting the offer, pronounced favorably upon his claims. In the meantime, he took no active part in the trend of affairs, but waited quietly for the dust to settle. In November, Dr. Cook canceled his lecture engagements and settled down to preparing the long-delayed proofs to be submitted as promised to the University of Copenhagen. This accomplished, he dispatched a typewritten copy to the University of Copenhagen, Denmark. After careful deliberation, the University of Copenhagen rendered its verdict to the world, which, summarized in 2 short words, left the claim of Dr. Frederick A. Cook to the discovery of the North Pole, April 21, 1908, not proven. End of chapter 24. Conclusion. For 23 years, Robert Edwin Peary has knocked valiantly at the portals of immortal fame. The castle nowhere, whose glistening walls of eternal ice lie shimmering in the brilliant sun, whose jeweled towers and minarets catch the glint of sparkling rainbows. The gates at last have opened and the banquet hall is set. Wild Arctic melodies fall grandly upon the ear. The cannonade of glaciers thunder a salute. About the festive board stand the heroes of the past according to their precedence and rank. Hail ye, Iva Beardson, hail, ye early Norsemen and ye Danes. There stand the Cabots, John the Father, Sebastian the bold son. There Sir Willoughby and Chancellor, and old Sir Humphrey Gilbert and a host of others. There Barents, there Baring, there Henry Hudson and old Baffin. 3 hearty cheers for Vaughan, Wrangle, Ross, and Peary, and brave old Sir John Franklin. Crozier and his men line at attention and salute. Ah, Elijah Kane, the beauty of a noble soul lies written in a gentle face. Francis Hall, thou dreamer, stand forth and welcome the arriving guest. German, Austrian, Norwegian, and Italian, stand thou behind the board, lift high the diamond chalice, and quaff the limpid draught in honor of the hero, for he comes. In one voice, down the ages goes the cry. All praise to him who conquers, and Peary, entering, bows and takes his seat. End of conclusion. End of The Great White North by Helen S. Wright.